because it was a do or die kind of a situation.
I suppose the effects of all this change will probably be felt a little bit unequally.
Generative AI is going to kind of push the issue a little bit and bring about some real changes.
Half of law firms in the US were still pen and paper just a few years ago.
Yeah, that's the secret sauce, and I've believed that's from the earliest days.
In this episode of the File Notes podcast, we spoke with Bob Ambrogi, whose career has taken him to the intersection of law, media, and technology. A lawyer, journalist, media consultant, and blogger, Bob is known internationally for his expertise in legal technology, legal practice, and legal ethics. Today, Bob writes the award-winning blog Law Sites, is a columnist for Above the Law and the ABA Journal, and hosts the podcast about innovation in law, Law Next. In 2011, Bob was named in the inaugural Fast Case 50, honouring the law's smartest, most courageous innovators, among many other honours and awards. So I can't wait to share this conversation with you about Bob's career. I'm sure you'll love it.
Well, Bob, it's great to see you. We first met more than a year ago now at ClioCon. But your reputation preceded you, of course, and I'm really excited for our conversation.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be on the show.
So, Bob, you've been a lawyer and a journalist focused on the law for a while. Before your career, you were born in a small town in West Massachusetts. What was life like growing up in Agawam?
I'm going to get myself in trouble here if anybody's listening from my hometown. But I mean, it was a very, I grew up in a very, sort of suburban, small town, but it was the kind of town that most people who grew up there look forward to getting out of, as opposed to staying there. It's not a kind of a place where you grow up and think this is where I want to spend the rest of my life. So I had a perfectly fine childhood in a wonderful little town, but was happy to move off and go to college.
Yeah, I spent some of my childhood growing up in small towns around New Zealand, and one of them is 3,000 people, and while it's perfectly lovely to spend time there and live there, I suppose there aren't many specialized opportunities to go and make a career out of. So people often look for bigger places to go.
Yeah, and just not a lot to do.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's relaxing, but it's also boring sometimes. So you started your career as a journalist, and along the way, you became a lawyer as well. Today, you do both, and as a journalist, you focus on the law and legal tech. Could you talk about why you went to school to study journalism and what your life was like at the time?
I was somebody who grew up always thinking that I wanted to be a writer of some kind, and I think in my long-term vision, I wanted to become a famous, world famous novelist or something of that sort. But I was always really intrigued by journalism. I had as early as I can remember was kind of writing, my high school newspaper. I was writing stories for that, and then I went to college. I was a journalism major when I went to college, and actually had an opportunity while I was in college to create and run a very small newspaper in a community in Western Massachusetts near where I grew up, that was focused on a community that was a multiracial, multi-ethnic community, and we used to put the newspaper out in multiple languages at the same time, Spanish and English and actually Italian as well. Not that I spoke all those, but it was quite an endeavor. But eventually I graduated, and I continued doing that newspaper for a bit, but it was not something that I was making a lot of money at, and I didn't see a lot of career opportunities there. And it was hard work and not all that financially rewarding. And I thought, well, if I want to get ahead in journalism, I need to go back and get an advanced degree in journalism. But when I talked to the professor who'd been my journalism advisor as an undergraduate, he discouraged me from going. The traditional route for me would have been to get a master's degree in journalism, but he discouraged me from that, saying that if you really want to get ahead in journalism, he said, get take some education that's going to teach you kind of how the world works. And I asked him what he meant, and he said, if I had it all to do over again, I would get a law degree. He said, if you understand the legal system and the laws, then you really kind of understand almost everything you're going to be writing about, if whether you're reporting on government or business or even family affairs, divorces, or whatever else it might be. All of that has a legal underpinning to it, and uh, I thought about it and kind of made sense, and hadn't really thought about the law all that much before that. But I went ahead and took the entrance exam for law school and did pretty well, and ended up going on to law school with the idea that it would further my career in journalism. But as you've already pointed out, it's kind of I've kind of taken two parallel paths throughout my career. I've kept one foot in the journalism world, and one foot in the law world, and in related ways. They're not obviously not black and white worlds, but it's been it worked out.
Yeah, definitely. And there are a lot of similarities across the work that lawyers and journalists do. Of course,
Absolutely.
yeah. And I think in the past, journalists have been some of the early adopters of, internet and technology, using it to share and distribute the news. In hindsight, it probably seems obvious how transformational the internet has been for really every area of work. But in the early 2000s, you rightly identified that the internet was something that would impact lawyers significantly, probably a lot earlier than most people. How did your interest in legal tech really start, and have you seen the industry evolve over time?
It was interesting. I was I up until that point, I had gone a little bit kind of back and forth between my law practice and journalism. When I first got out of law school, I decided to go into law practice, and I was working as a lawyer. But I started to regret that I hadn't gone back into journalism as I intended, and I had an opportunity come along to become the editor of a legal newspaper, a newspaper for lawyers here in the United States, and out of that, I started doing that, and then I moved from that job to another job. Um, but there was a point at which I was thinking about transitioning, or maybe I already had kind of transitioned back into law practice again. As you can see, I went back and forth a bit, and I was thinking about, well, when I work at these companies, or when I've worked in big law firms, I've had access to uh, some of the prime legal research resources and that kind of thing. But if I were to go out on my own, I don't know that I could afford all that stuff. So I started to think about, well, there's this internet thing out there, and I wonder what I can do on the internet in terms of performing legal research or finding cases or whatever else. And so I started playing around with the internet, and this was in the days before the web had been invented. I mean, this was the old sort of raw internet where you were basically just kind of all text based, all kind of coding your way around. It was difficult to use, very, very esoteric. Um, but I did kind of begin to see the potential, I think, especially once the web did come along, which was in 90, was that 93, 94, something like that, when the web kind of launched. But at that point, I just really started to see, well, wow, there's some really potential here for lawyers to use this medium, and at that point, without having to spend a lot of money. I mean, just about. I mean, everything was free on the internet in those days. There were no commercial services or anything else. So I just decided to start. I thought they should know about it. I thought lawyers should know about it. Nobody was really writing about it at that point or talking much about it, other than maybe a couple of academics in law schools. And so I started what was then a syndicated column. I started calling up different bar associations and legal newspapers and whatever, and said, I'm going to be writing this column about the internet for lawyers, and would you like to buy it? And I had a number of people take me up on it, and I got a bunch of subscribers for that, and that grew into another publication, and that grew into a couple books, and that grew into my launching a blog and then a podcast, and it kind of led me down a path that I certainly didn't anticipate at the time I started doing it. And I'll have to say, I certainly never thought I'd be doing it this much beyond when I first started doing it.
Yeah, I can imagine it's been quite a journey from those early days, and you've probably seen a lot of things that maybe you expected and seemed obvious, and probably some things that came out of the walls and seemed really crazy. Like what? How do you um, how do you think the way lawyers practice the law and serve clients will change kind of in the future? Call it 10 years from now.
Oh man, it's changed so dramatically in the years I have been doing this. I mean, I sometimes joke when I'm asked to speak to a group about technology or the internet that the reason they like to invite me in is that I'm old enough to remember what it was like before we had any of this stuff, and I really am. I mean, I remember when law practice was entirely paper based. When there was virtually no digital or online resources, and where we typed out documents on typewriters with carbon paper and that sort of thing. And it has changed so dramatically in the years that I have been practicing, and it just continues to accelerate. The pace of change continues to accelerate. Um, I think there's no question that artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, which is what everybody is talking about these days, um, is going to have cause a sea change in legal practice. I think it's going to dramatically restructure how lawyers deliver services. It's going to dramatically structure even the roles of different kinds of legal professionals. It's going to dramatically change what clients can do for themselves versus what they need a lawyer for. Um, so, I think it remains to be seen what that's going to look like in 10 years, but um, it, the tasks that lawyers focus on is going to be much different. Their relationship to their clients, I think, is going to be much different, and a lot of the just sort of mundane things that remain a part of practicing law perhaps will go away. Perhaps AI will take over a lot of that. Um, if I could, not to go on too long about this, but I mean, a particular interest of mine, a particular passion of mine, really has been the use of technology to close the justice gap and to enhance access to the justice system by those who can't afford it or who maybe are geographically remote for it or whatever else. And I really believe that the potential for generative AI to change that equation is huge, and that means that there are going to be new forms of entities, perhaps delivering legal help, legal services, whatever you want to call it, and reaching large numbers of people who perhaps haven't had that access up until now. So that could ultimately be the greatest change a decade from now, maybe 5 years from now, even.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. And if you look at any of the previous kind of fundamental technological changes that have introduced these like new platforms, for lack of a better word, like mobile or like cloud-based software, they have been really deflationary for for prices on average. And so, with AI, one of the consequences of the technology that will be available due to like generative AI in a few years' time is that it'll be much more accessible to build software. Um, and of course the type of software that's available will be very different. And so yeah, it'll be fantastic to have some of those areas of law like legal aid being much more accessible due to some of these new solutions that are able to be provided at a really low cost, and are able to be made really accessible regardless of the language you speak, or as you say, your geography. So that's really exciting.
Yeah,
Something,
and I would
yeah.
agree that just not to cut you off, but I mean, I think part what goes along with exactly what you're saying is evolution or changes in who it is that's developing that software and delivering that software. I mean, a big topic of conversation over the last few years in the United States has been this whole idea of deregulation of the delivery of legal services, of allowing alternative business structures to deliver legal help of various kinds. And I know we're behind other jurisdictions in having that conversation, but I do think that the advent of generative AI is going to kind of push the issue a little bit, and bring about some real changes there as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I mean, I see here in here in Australia where I live now, in my home in New Zealand, there are like a diverse range of companies as opposed to law firms that have legal professionals on staff and provide legal services to their clients. And it does really, I guess, open the door for more diverse approaches to providing legal services, and can have some interesting consequences. To change tune slightly, something I often hear from like more or less like tech bros, kind of like me, I guess, and like venture capital investors, is they're very optimistic about technology, and often expect timescales to be really short. And people say, oh, generative AI is going to just like be used by everyone everywhere in a few years' time, and that's not really what we've seen in the past. So I think it'll be quite interesting to see things like, for instance, a few years ago, only 50% of law firms in the US were using cloud-based tools to manage their
Mm-hmm.
practices, or practice
Mm-hmm.
management systems in general. So half of law firms in the US were still pen and paper just a few years ago. So to think we'll see, this explosion of use of AI amongst that demographic of people in the legal industry, might be a little bit naive, but it will be certainly. I'm sure we'll see a lot of like diversity in how the technology is used and who's using it, and things like that too.
Right. Well, and
Yeah.
there do come these events that accelerate that momentum and that pace of adoption. Obviously, the pandemic was one of them. We've all talked about that, but that had a dramatic impact on the numbers of lawyers who were adopting cloud technology, or
Mm,
even using some basic technology, because it was a do or die kind of a situation in
mm,
terms of adopting some of that technology. And you know, it's hard to say with generative AI, because what we're like a year into it,
mm,
and there've been no kind of earth shattering or earth changing applications that have come along so far, I don't think. But cumulatively, we're starting to see some important uses for this technology, and again, I think cumulatively, it's going to be clear. The writing will be on the wall pretty quickly that you know it's adapt or die for lawyers. I mean, Thomson Reuters just came out with a study on the U.S. legal market just this week that I wrote about earlier this week. That, I mean, that was kind of the theme of their study was, they talked about the failure of Pan American Airways, which is, once the world's largest global air carrier, and kind of recognized for its for being an innovative airlines. Um, but it kind of saw the world the way it once was, and failed to see the way the world was changing, and it no longer exists. And that could well happen to lawyers who don't get on board with generative AI.
yeah, yeah, definitely. I think what we're seeing is that people are really responding to that, and this new kind of technology. And I guess it's constantly in the news, so people are really like, hey, I really need to start adopting technology. So even people who may have been called laggards in the recent past are kind of getting the things together and trying to move forward, which is exciting
Mhm.
to see as well.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yeah, and I suppose the effects of all this change will probably be felt a little bit unequally. So maybe in certain areas or specializations of the law, we'll see more disruption faster than others.
Today's episode is sponsored by VXT, the phone system built for law firms. VXT integrates with practice management systems so that when lawyers make calls, their billable time and legal advice can be saved in the right place automatically. 20% of billable time goes unrecorded. A lot of that is phone calls that get forgotten about. Get some of those billables back using VXT. Go to vxt.co.nz or click the link in the description to find out more.
So I wanna move back to journalism a little bit now. You talked about leading newspapers throughout your career, and um, you mentioned how it was a lot of hard work, especially when you took your first role leading a newspaper out of college. I'd love to understand, like, what do you see as being the largest challenges that you faced when you were leading those newspapers?
Yeah, it's a good question. With that first newspaper, it was really simply the fact that I was, as they say, chef, cook, and bottle washer. I was doing everything for that newspaper. I was coming up with the stories. I was writing the stories. I was doing the photography. I had a dark room where I was going in and, this was in the days before digital photography. I was developing film. I was then going out and selling advertising and literally distributing distributing the newspaper to the various places. I didn't go house to house, but we had pickup points around the town. I was doing the typesetting for it. We had to go to this printer and you had to kind of manually do the typesetting and then lay it all out. So it was a lot of work, just manually a lot of work. Fortunately, a lot of that kind of stuff has changed over the years. Um, and for the challenge in my law practice, and I do continue to practice law, and I actually represent newspapers as a lawyer. They are my clients, and I represent an association of newspapers and news organizations here in the state where I live in Massachusetts. I represent all of the newspapers as an organization here, and I mean the challenges now is really the move toward digital. I mean, nothing we're not all aware of, but it's the move to digital and what that has meant for advertising, what that has meant for circulation, what that has meant for the sort of the speed of reporting, the pace of reporting, and it's just an entirely running. You know, we keep using the word newspaper, but paper is almost an irrelevant concept in a sense right now. Plenty of them still publish in paper, but even the smallest ones that publish in paper can't be just paper. They have to be digital as well. They have to be plugged into the digital cycle of 24/7 news. They have to be video production crews and everything else. So it's just a whole different profession now, and it's a much more in a sense the profession as is now is demanding in a different way, but demanding certainly as it for journalists and editors, might very demanding of their time. Again, because it's not enough to just say, "Here's my story for the day" and put it to bed. It's that story could be changing throughout the day, and I might be filing it several times, and meanwhile, I might be writing 5 other stories as well today. Um, there's only so much they can do. The advertising model has been hard. It's been hard for a lot of the major news organizations to figure that out, um, and figure out how to continue to sustain. Some have done very well at it. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, obviously have seem to have found a formula that works quite successfully for them. But I think a lot of other publications are struggling to figure out how to do it. Even for I do a blog and I do a podcast, and those are businesses for me as well as hobbies or whatever you want to call them. And um, it's taken us some time to kind of develop a business model that works for that can help sustain the work that we put into it as well.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about how those challenges have shifted over time. And, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm sure you know, but I think there was recently, in the past year or so, this issue in maybe Europe where uh, Facebook was being asked to, I think, pay newspapers for to display news on social media, and they responded by suggesting that they would like prevent news from being shared on their platforms. And that's just something that I suppose you wouldn't have had to think about prior to having all of these digital channels to share the news on.
Yeah, it's a real struggle because for a lot of newspaper, I'm asked a lot, like, does anybody read newspapers anymore? And of course, what's the truth is they're reading them voraciously, but they're not reading them in the same way they used to read them. It's not like we sit down with a piece of paper and flip through the pages. It's that they come up on our Facebook news feed, or they come up on Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, whatever we want to call it, or on LinkedIn. The articles are still getting read. Most newspapers will tell you their readership is greater than it's ever been. Even some small papers, a local small town newspaper will have greater readership than it's ever had because everybody's moved out of that small town and moved across the country or across the globe, still reading it online because they want to keep up with what's going on. Um, but that tension between kind of understanding that those social media platforms are a source of readership, but also not wanting to give away the show to those social media platforms creates some real issues. We just saw it now with the this legal battle going on between the New York Times and OpenAI over. It's a little bit different of an issue, but to what extent did OpenAI effectively, copy or steal content from the New York Times in order to train its large language model? Um, uh, and just what is copyright and what is the copying and stealing in that context? They're challenging issues that nobody has any answers for, and the legal system will undoubtedly sort them out over the next few years, or at least try to. But they're really interesting questions and difficult ones.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it really, what you're teasing out there is that like, nothing is really black and white, is it? Because you have this concept where, copyright, I can't, exactly duplicate your work and pass it off as my own. But generally, in the context of humans, that it's been well understood that I can read Bob's work and I can read everyone else's work, and then I can kind of use that to inform my own perspective on something. And if you think about it, of course, that's what these like models that OpenAI are developing is doing. It's reading everyone's work and then
Yeah,
using that to kind of produce something novel and unique.
right.
But their arguments is like where along that spectrum does training a large language model fall? And I suppose it's unclear what is fair and just in the context of all of that, and if someone should pay for access to that data. And it's what's going to be really interesting from my perspective is how it's not necessarily the decisions that are made from a legal perspective, but how do these things affect the way the internet works? Because, of course, for the last 20 odd years, 25 years, call it, um, most of the internet has been entirely open, and very, very small percentage has been like hidden behind paywalls and other restrictions. But of course, if we have all of these if we have all of these tools that are using all of the data that's out there to build commercial products, then and the value is now in the data so much more, then we'll probably go to almost take a back step into this like closed ecosystem where every website has like a login page and you can't access it unless you're like an authenticated user or something like that. And maybe that's a good thing, maybe it's bad, I'm not sure, but it's kind of weird to think about.
Yeah, I think that would be a bad thing. I mean, it really is interesting. And as you point out, it's really this question of, are these large language models learning from this content, or are they copying in some way this content? And the understanding has, up until now, has largely been it's that they're learning, that they're not sort of going to just replicate. They're not going to spit out verbatim an article that appeared in the New York Times because you asked a query related to that. Uh, but but who knows? I mean, one of the problems is that for many of these LLMs are effectively black boxes, and we don't fully know how they're working or what's happening behind the scenes. So again, I think litigation, perhaps if it gets to that over the next couple of years, is going to tell us a whole lot that we need to know about what's going on in the background with these systems, and will have a lot to do with determining the answer to the point you raise of whether things are going to get locked down or remain open. Let's hope they remain open.
Yeah, definitely. Something just an interesting point on that is I think it is easy for an LLM uh, to just copy and paste an answer from one of their sources of data, and that's actually something that's been seen at a lot of alternatives to companies like OpenAI. There've been a few LLMs that I've seen on X where if any of the listeners are familiar with software engineering, there was a LLM that, um, as an answer, provided an API key, which is this piece of information that you can use to access a service, and it's meant to identify who you are, and it should never be shared with other parties. And so somehow this language model came to read this API key and then give it to someone else as an answer, and it worked. And oftentimes, use of an API is charged for. So presumably, this LM shared this thing, and then other people were using it, and were racking up a bill for someone they didn't know somewhere else. And so, I think a lot of the often probably the difference between copying and learning and generation will come down to who's building the model and how good are they at preventing copyright infringement.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
really interesting. There was an article in the New York Times. I think it was the New York Times a couple weeks ago about manipulating um, ChatGPT um, to provide the email addresses of reporters at the New York Times, something like that. I mean, not that those are necessarily private or something you don't want to disclose, but the kind of information that in theory you shouldn't be able to get out of GPT, and yet by querying it in a certain way, they were able to do that.
Yeah, yeah, I watched an interesting video on all of the ways you can practically breach language models and how it's like a new surface for hackers and bad actors to like use in their like nefarious acts. Um, so moving on from this kind of the topic of artificial intelligence, which I'm sure we could probably talk about for the whole rest of the episode, I'd love to kind of step back more directly into journalism. And I'd really appreciate it if you could break down for me kind of the step-by-step process of how you go from seeing the hint of, possibly there's an interesting story here to actually, sharing a story. And maybe that looks like identification of the story, research, drafting, publishing. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends, like everything else, and it all depends on the context and the story and the publication. Um, and I mean, if you're asking about me personally, as opposed to something of a more generic nature, then I think it's interesting that it's kind of evolved quite a bit for me over the years. I started my blog. I hate to say this, like 22 years ago. I've been doing this a long time. Had one of the earliest blogs in the legal world, and I knew at that point that I wanted to be kind of covering this development of the internet and that kind of more, not morphed into that kind of expanded into covering legal tech more broadly. Um, but at that point, it was um, challenging to come up with stories because it required a lot of kind of uh, uh, legwork in a sense, the online legwork, but just trying to keep up with everything that was going on, which was, again, nowhere near what's going on these days. But it also wasn't as easy to keep up in those days. And so it's just kind of reading a lot of sources, keeping up with a lot of sources, trying to put the pieces together and then identify what could make a good story out of that. And then I mean, once you've sort of identified a story, then there's various ways you can go at it. But I mean, the basics of writing a story really haven't changed that much. I mean, it's generally a matter of figuring out who you should be talking to and trying to get those conversations and trying to figure out what else there is out there that can uh, corroborate or substantiate or otherwise what you're writing about, and then putting it all together into a narrative. I mean, you said earlier that there's a lot of similarities between the practice of law and the practice of journalism, and I think that's 100% true. I mean, the process of what a lawyer does and what a journalism does both kind of boil down to this idea of like pulling together the facts and the sources and the information and then putting it together into a narrative that tells a story, and then presenting that story to your audience, and whether you're a journalist or a lawyer, that's kind of what you're doing every day. um, I think that for me that what's evolved a lot now is that because of the fact that I've uh, in part because of the fact that I've gained prominence as somebody who writes about this, and also just in part because of the fact that this area has accelerated to such a degree. I am just, I'm getting inundated every day with people asking me to write about them, trying to get me to write about them. Um, and there's so much going on that I personally, I don't think this is a something I'm not necessarily happy about, but I think it's become harder for me to do the really kind of in-depth pieces I'd like to be doing more of, and I spend a lot more time doing the sort of breaking news kinds of articles, in the sense of this company just got a huge investment, or this company just got acquired, or they just launched this new product that's pretty cool. So I tend to focus a lot more these days on what's happening now, as opposed to a deeper dive into what has happened or what is likely to be happening, which I'd like to do more of, and maybe I'll start to do more of it over the next year or so.
Yeah, definitely. And you
Excuse me.
mentioned that you, for more than 20 years, have been writing blogs, hosting podcasts on the intersection of law and technology. One of your more notable, I guess, blogs or channels for distributing all of this has been lawnext.com. What is lawnext.com?
Well, lawnext.com is actually a sort of newer invention as a domain name, that's become a home for a couple of different things that we're doing. But originally, the blog I started way back 22 years ago was called Law Sites, and it was called that because originally I was mostly just writing about law-related websites. I was kind of tracking, as I said, the early days of the web and the internet as it impacted lawyers. And that's the main platform on which I write stories, and all of that. Also, way back in 2005, I started podcasting, but I was doing a totally different podcast for a long time, and then in 2018, I decided to start my own podcast. The other one I'd been doing it in partnership with somebody else. Excuse me. So I started a podcast called Law Next, and I liked the name because it suggested focusing on the future of law practice and what's coming. And I really kind of tried to focus on talking to people who are sort of entrepreneurs, innovators in the legal field about what's coming down the pike and what they're doing now. And that kind of out of those two main things, and I also do another podcast every Friday where we do a called Legal Tech Week, where we have a roundtable of journalists and bloggers who kind of talk about the top stories of the week in legal tech and innovation. But out of all that, I also realized at some point that I was just accumulating just huge amounts of information about a whole lot of different legal tech companies, and I thought that I should try and organize that in some way that would make it more useful to consumers. That there aren't a lot of good sites for consumers of legal tech to um, go in and find information about the companies that might do what they need, or user reviews or that kind of thing. So we decided to start a legal tech directory, something like a Capterra type of a thing, but focused on the legal industry. And so somewhere along that, and that was just a couple of years ago that we launched the directory, but somewhere in all of that, we decided to group it all together under this umbrella, lawnext.com, and my blog is there, and my podcast is there, and our legal tech directory is there, and sort of an expanding small portfolio of publications and podcasts and products that all relate to that domain. LawNext is my home.
Yeah, we should probably, Bob, we should probably build a Bob LLM based on all of that information you've accumulated over the years.
Well, my son has been trying to do that. He was working on doing that, actually. My son is a programmer, actually, at my case. I think you
Oh,
know my
well.
case, but on the side, he was playing around with creating a generative a chat interface anyway into all my stuff.
That's so fun. So you've hosted your Law Next podcast for more than 240 episodes. You touched on kind of how it got started, but how have you grown the podcast and your audience for Law Next over the years?
Um, it's uh, it's kind of just taken on a life of its own. I wish I could say I was smarter about marketing and growing it, but it's been very organic. I think. I mean, again, just since between 2018 to now, the numbers of legal podcasts has snowballed in a huge way. Glad you have your podcast, and glad there's a whole lot of other podcasts out there. But in 2018, it was still not like a hugely crowded field. It wasn't like everybody and their mother had a podcast. Now it is a hugely crowded field, and it gets harder and harder, I think, for anybody with a podcast to stand out and build audience. Um, but I think I do have that primacy advantage, maybe a early launch advantage, where I think we built up kind of name recognition and audience ahead of the curve, and I think that's continued to build on itself. So I think we could actually do a whole lot better job at kind of marketing and building up audience, but the audience has just continued to grow, and we just continue to try and get guests that we think are just kind of continue to focus on that issue of sort of innovation and what's coming in law and legal tech. A lot of it is very legal tech focused, and I get a lot of founders and that sort of thing. But it's like I say, it's developed a life of its own, and I just try and keep up with it.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, actually, maybe this might be surprising for some of our listeners, but I've gotten a lot of advice from people who are much smarter than me about content marketing and distributing things like podcasts and content. And the number one advice that I've gotten from the most successful people in the area is that you should focus almost exclusively on producing content that is valuable for your audience, and then it will
Hmm.
practically distribute itself as long as you haven't made any massive errors. So really, I think probably what you've done, Bob, is like the best thing to do is just focus on the content, make great content, and people will come.
Yeah, that's the secret sauce, and I've believed that's from the earliest days. I mean, I used to have people tell me how I needed to work on SEO on my blog and all of that sort of thing. And the blog is its own SEO, and if you write good content, and if you write important content that people are going to want to read and find valuable, uh, they're going to find it and they're going to read it, and it's going to grow.
And tell their friends about it. Yeah. Yeah, awesome. Well, we have released just 10 episodes of our podcast, the File Notes podcast. And so, do you have any tips for me?
Well, I think probably my number one tip would have been what you just said, which is just to focus on quality, on good guests. I mean, you do a great job interviewing, and it's really professionally done. Um, Consistency is important. I've seen so many lawyers or legal professionals who will make a big splash about starting a podcast, and then they just get too busy or lose interest or whatever, and then the episodes start to slack off. Uh, we do it every week, and I've been podcasting pretty much every week, at least once every week, more or less since 2005, and just keep at it and keep putting it out there. Um, it is fun I think about. I'm always thinking about how I can who I can talk to, and I usually whenever I travel to a conference or whatever else, I bring at least some basic podcasting equipment so I can walk up to somebody and say, hey, you want to sit down and record an interview? And often we will impromptu just sit down and have a conversation. I won't have prepared for it at all, which usually would terrify me, but sometimes those impromptu conversations end up being the best ones and the most natural and the most free flowing. So, but no, I think it's just thinking about quality content, consistency, knowing knowing your show. No, it's hard to know your audience. People always say know your audience, but with podcasting, you don't know who's out there downloading it. You think you know, and you guess that they must be a certain group of people who would be interested in the stuff you're talking about, but you don't always know other than the feedback you get when you run into people here and there. But I think, know yourself, know what you want to do with it, and just keep at it.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate that. Thank you. Um, so what's this might be a bit of a pun, but what's next for you, Bob?
Um, for me, it's what's next. I think is pretty much just kind of continuing continuing in the normal course. I go to a lot of legal tech conferences, so I'm about to launch into the whole legal tech season. In a couple of weeks, I'll be going off to Legal Week in New York, which is one of the oldest and longest standing legal tech conferences. From there, I'll go to uh, the Legal Services Corporation, which operates all the kind of uh, you know, the legal services offices in the United States that provide services to low income individuals. They have a big innovations in tech conference every year. And I'll go right from New York down to that conference. And then a few weeks after that is Tech Show in ABA Tech Show in Chicago, where I know your team will be there as well. And at that show, I run something called Startup Alley, which is a startup pitch competition on the opening night of the show. And so that's my calendar for the next few weeks.
Awesome. Very exciting. Well, for our listeners, Bob, how should they connect with you?
Well, lawnext.com, you can find all of our stuff there. My podcast, LawNext, you can find on any podcast player you prefer to use. We also do the Legal Tech Week podcast, which is both available on podcast platforms and on YouTube. And anybody wants to just reach out to me directly, the easiest way is just email me. It's Ambrogi, Ambrogi at gmail.com.
Fantastic. Well, thanks so much for joining me, Bob. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Me too, Luke. I really appreciate it. I'm really honored to be on it. And it's a great show. So thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for this episode of File Notes. To keep up with the latest episodes and content, follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube at File Notes Podcast. You can also visit us on our website at vxt.co.nz/podcast/file notes to subscribe to our email list and never miss an episode. That's vxt.co.nz/podcasts/file notes. See you there.